Well, hello again, and welcome to our study of Genesis chapter 4. We're continuing our study going through the key chapters of the Bible, and now we go to Genesis 4. So far, we've gone to look at Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and we have seen God's creation of the universe and of man. We saw everything was created good. We saw in Genesis 3 that sin came into the world through Adam's disobedience. And we saw that the Lord had banished Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden because if they were to stay there and partake of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and live forever, they would live forever in a state of separation from the Lord. So now we go to Genesis 4, and we're continuing this account of the genesis of mankind. We're learning about what that looked like as God's warning about sin comes to fruition. He had warned them that they would die, and we're seeing death coming in Genesis 4 with the first death. We had learned that they wanted this knowledge of good and evil, and that's part of what was their motivation for disobeying the Lord. But we're seeing in Genesis 4 that the knowledge of good and evil is too much for man to contain, that it has a mastery over us and it drives us. And so we go into Genesis 4, and there's a lot to cover here, and I'm going to try to get through it if I can relatively quickly so we don't keep you all day here, but there is a lot. For instance, the first couple of verses are the record of the birth of Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve's first two sons. Then we see that they offer a sacrifice to the Lord. Then God accepts Abel's sacrifice and not Cain's sacrifice. Cain is angry about this. The Lord warns Cain about this. Cain ends up killing Abel. He ends up being then confronted by the Lord, who then pronounces a judgment upon him. And then we see the establishment of society that is apart from God or separate from God. And then we see the introduction of Seth and perhaps even a nod to his godly lineage. So let's go back to the opening verses of Genesis 4 and just kind of give an overview of this chapter. Again, verses 1 and 2, Adam and Eve give birth to Cain and Abel. And then in verses 3 and 4, they bring a sacrifice to the Lord. And so in verse 3, Cain brings a sacrifice, and then Abel brings a sacrifice as well. And it's interesting to see that Cain is the first to bring a sacrifice, and we're going to find out that his sacrifice was the first sacrifice ever brought and also ever rejected by the Lord. Because it says at the end of verse 4, and the Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering, but for Cain and for his offering he had no regard. You have what seems to be a sincere offer of worship to the Lord that is rejected. And this just seems so counterintuitive to what we would expect. But the Lord gives us the answer to why God rejected Cain's sacrifice. For instance, let's go to Hebrews 11, chapter 4. So kind of put your finger here in Genesis 4, and let's go to Hebrews 11, chapter 4. It says, by faith, Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained the testimony that he was righteous, God testifying about his gifts, and through faith, though he is dead, he still speaks. And so here we see that the reason why the Lord accepted Abel's sacrifice is because it was offered with faith. Cain's wasn't offered in faith. In fact, if you turn over to 1 John chapter 3, verse 12, we get another insight into Cain and his motivations. 1 John 3:12 says, not as Cain, who was of the evil one and slew his brother. And for what reason did he slay him? Because his deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. Now that gives us another vantage point on Cain and his heart. It says that Cain's actions were evil, but why? Because he was of the evil one. And so at some level and in some way, Cain was more aligned with the work of God's enemy, with Satan, than with seeking to please the Lord. And so for that reason, because it was not offered in sincere faith to the Lord, but it was really ultimately the product of a demonic religion, it was rejected by God. And we're going to see later on that this is just the self-made religion that God rejects. And we have to bring him the true worship that he calls us to based on the truth he has given to us. We just can't make things up for ourselves. So, God accepted Abel's offering because it was by faith. He rejects Cain's offering. And then Cain is angry about this, though. And so in verse 5, Cain is angry. He's not repentant. He's not going back to the Lord saying, Lord, what do I have to do to get this right? What is it I need to do to please you? He's not regarding God at all. It's just you see his pride in his heart. In verse 7, the Lord warns Cain about his sin, and he says, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. But of course, we see in verse 8, Cain doesn't master it. It says at the end of verse 8, he rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him. And so we're seeing now just the reality of sin and what it does to a person, how it eats away at them and causes them to commit all kinds of evil, like Cain killing his brother. And so the Lord then comes to Cain, and they get into this discussion. The Lord says in verse 9, where is Abel your brother? And Cain says, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And that is a haughty lie. One, he does know where Abel is. He's the one who killed him and buried him. And two, he is his brother's keeper. We are called to care for those around us. And so the Lord pronounces judgment upon him. There's a curse on the ground in verse 11. And when he cultivates in verse 12, it won't yield its strength. And therefore, he has to wander because he can't just have a farm and have a place of his own. It's just not going to work very well. He's going to wander around. Cain says, this is too much for me to bear. The Lord places a mark on him, some kind of protective mark. We don't really know what that mark is. I think it may be outside of the need to spend too much time wondering about it, other than to say God in his mercy had some kind of protective mark that he placed upon Cain. Then in verse 16 it says, then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Verse 17, Cain had relations with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. Now, a lot of times people will question, hey, where did Cain get his wife? And I don't really understand why they ask that question, because if you just drop your eyes down to Genesis 5:4, it says, then the days of Adam after he became the father of Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. And so, where did Cain get his wife? Well, we see here that not every child is recorded, not every name is listed, and so clearly Adam had other sons and other daughters, and Cain married one of his sisters. Now, in our day and age, that's kind of freaky, but back then, especially in the first family, that's going to be okay. And so Cain marries his wife, they have children, and then we see in verses 18 to 24 an entire society that is now set up that's built on the principles of man. Uh, we even the fact that Cain is trying to establish this city is showing that he's really not interested in obeying the Lord and submitting to the Lord, because the Lord has said you're going to wander, and yet here he is creating and establishing this city. And then in this city, you see they create ranching and farming, even the arts. In verse 21, it says his brother's name was Jubal. We get the word Jubilee from, and he was the father of all those who play the lyre and the pipe. And so these are musical instruments. And so society is set on up. And then at the end, we see that Seth comes in the scene. And at the end of verse 26, it says, then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. And so you get this sense that Cain and his descendants are just doing their own thing. Seth and his descendants are calling upon the name of the Lord. So with that, what can we take away from this passage here? Well, as we go through our day, we should ask ourselves, what are we offering to the Lord in our day, at work, at home, with our families, with our coworkers or our friends or our neighbors? What are we offering to the Lord? And is it from faith? Is it out of obligation? Is it because of what people see? Or are we doing it as a gift to the Lord out of devotion to him? Jude 11 talks about the way of Cain, and that's just a reference to this passage here. And what is the way of Cain? Are we in any way living the way of Cain? Well, the way of Cain is sin. Now, the way of Cain is giving ourselves over to sin and allowing sin to master us. The way of Cain is having a lack of repentance, that when we're shown our sin or even warned about our sin, we don't turn from it. It's an indifference to God. It is self-made religion, and it is ultimately a self-made and godless society. Is there any way in our life that is in the line of the way of Cain? The Lord warned Cain that sin was crouching at the door. Is there any sin in our life that we look around and think, yeah, that's crouching at the door? Maybe it's a temptation. Maybe it's a challenge we're having with a friend or family member or someone else, and we're tempted to sin. We need to take that to the cross and bring that to the Lord and ask Him to crucify that sin in our heart, really crucify the idol in our heart. Romans 8:13 talks about how we need to, by the Spirit, put to death the deeds of the body. And we just need to bring that to the Lord and ask Him to crucify that sin. And finally, let's remember the God we serve and the God we worship. That although God is holy and has a perfect standard, and although His judgment is just and it is properly poured out upon Cain here, we also see that God is a God of love and compassion and mercy, and that His justice is not in any way contradictory or in any way out of balance to His love and compassion and mercy, and that God still has mercy on Cain. We serve a God of love and grace. We serve a God who is worthy of our worship. May you go throughout your day today loving, worshiping, and serving this God. Have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow. God bless.